Namaste and welcome to the Bharatvaarta podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. The new draft e-commerce policy by the government will touch upon multiple aspects of the e-commerce business itself and has wide-ranging consequences for all stakeholders involved. Understandably, there's a lot of debate, skepticism on certain clauses of the policy. To make sense of all of these policy proposals, changes, and also to understand what is the right way to look at some of these things, I'm joined by two very special guests. We have Rajeev Mantri, who's an investor and a best-selling author. He's also the managing director at Navam Capital. You've heard him on multiple Bharatvaarta podcasts earlier, speaking about startups, economy, policy, and related subjects. So welcome, Rajeev. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you, Roshan.
And we're joined by Ramesh Kailasam. He's the CEO of indiatech.org, a think tank and industry group set up to support internet startups. Ramesh has over 2 decades of experience working with industry and government. He's also a regular columnist in prominent Indian newspapers and appears on Indian television on policy discussions. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Ramesh.
Thank you.
Right. So this is going to be a fairly comprehensive discussion. We're going to cover a wide base of things. So to get started, Ramesh, what are the key changes that have been proposed in the new e-commerce policy itself? And maybe if you could also step back and give us a little bit of a background as to, why some of this was necessitated.
If you look at the Consumer Protection Act and the subsequent rules that came in, and we are discussing in detail the e-commerce rules today. But if we step back and see what necessarily actually pushed the government to move towards a new Consumer Protection Act, the earlier act that we had in this country was the Consumer Protection Act 1986. And this particular, the 2019 bill was enacted by the Lok Sabha on 30th July 2019 and subsequently Rajya Sabha on 6th August 2019. And then subsequently the act, as I always say, is a 1,000 feet statement. The guidelines bring it down to 100 feet, and the rules actually give you the ground level kind of state of play of kind of translating that act, which was passed by the legislature or the parliament, and actually converting that into on-ground rules of state of play and so on. So what typically happened was that instead of amending the 1986 Act, the government actually decided to bring a new law. For two simple reasons. One was, of course, that the state of play around the kinds of businesses drastically changed. And more importantly, even for customers, there were new definitions, new businesses they were interacting with. And there was a need for a law to offer better security for consumers. So if you look at the 86 Act, it had certain features, it didn't have certain features. For example, even the ministry had limited powers to make rules and so on, and therefore it was stifling in nature. The other interesting thing was that prior to DIPP becoming DPIIT, where the internal trade got added to Ministry of Commerce, and therefore the DIPP became DPIIT, the last IT meaning internal trade. Internal trade was as subject sitting inside the Ministry of Consumer Affairs. And most of the issues and disputes that were relating to disputes were actually going to Ministry of Commerce because people felt that e-commerce fell under the Ministry of Commerce. But in technicality, those used to be referred back to Consumer Affairs to say, hey, you're one single guy there who's sitting there managing the whole country's internal trade, whether it is rise in prices of aloo or onions or whatever, or dal prices, or for that matter, even e-commerce. That was the expense that was lying with them. So the new Consumer Protection Act covers a range of things that are more customer friendly. But just to quickly wrap up on the 86 Act versus the 2019 Act, 86 Act didn't have a regulator. This Act actually talks about, forming a separate kind of a set of authorities to consider grievance and unfair contracts and so on. All goods and services were for consideration in the 86 Act. While free and personal services were excluded, but in this, everything has been included. I mean, the broader definition talks about all goods and services where we have issues when the rules get translated, because those are the submissions we have made. So it includes everything. Typically, if you go by the language, it should ideally cover all goods and services, telecom, housing, and online shopping and tele-shopping, and everything should ideally be covered under the new Act. Plus, of course, there was no provision for product liability in the earlier one. The current one talks about product liability. It also talks about different types of practices, different kinds of authorities. And more importantly, it also brings in direct selling, which earlier did not find a master anywhere. Direct selling is all your goods that are sold by all the big names and the local names, where you have a single product being sold through homes and women selling in their apartments and so on. Direct selling was brought under this purview, and e-commerce also was brought under this purview. Typically, if you look at it, you have a range of new age, new type of buying and selling products which have been covered under this. Now, typically, this should be a Consumer Protection Act. So the act is fairly elaborate as regards what the consumer is eligible for, what they should do, where are their grievance mechanisms, and what needs to be put in place by the industry. Although some of the language is still archaic. For example, it mandates that you should have a fax machine when most of the people are saying we are comfortable with an email, but it insists that you should have a fax. So things like those are some leftovers from the 86 Act and others, which is still going on. But if we come back to your prime question on what are the key changes proposed, there are a range of amendments that have been proposed and the rules that have been notified. So the rules got notified, and then they brought amendments to the rules, which is what is the one we are discussing today. These have been introduced with an intent of what they call as enhancing consumer protection and kind of sort of creating a level playing field for sellers that is between offline world and online world. Now, it is a bit kind of odd. You may think that a Consumer Protection Act is telling how an online seller and an offline seller, and it draws a distinction between them, when ideally it should be fully talking about consumer protection. But it does delve into a lot of things, which is where it begins to start transgressing on a lot of other regulations and rules. For example, you're falling into domain of even other online entities because it's a broad definition of goods and services. In some places, it does get trapped because the language largely seems to be written for goods, but it gets trapped because it uses the word liberally services. So somewhere you might not be able to see correlation on how come this can be done in a goods world, but how can this be done in a services world? And in case of e-commerce players who do not deal with retail goods and are involved in services, let's assume whether you are a travel app, or you are a cab hailing app, or you are an insurance web aggregator, or you are a social media or gaming or financial services or telecom and so on. Many of these are already governed by existing regulations and regulators. But because the rules liberally use the term goods and services, and because the definitions in the new Consumer Protection Act also use the term services, it does put it somewhere in a conflict road with existing regulations, which is why we have been writing about this in detail with examples clause by clause, and that's what we have submitted to state that there are many places where you will come in direct conflict with existing regulations of other acts. And one thing, of course, it clearly seems to be heading towards is the fact that it has tried to give an impression of protecting local offline businesses, which is a big constituency in India. If you look at, there are 7 crore shops, you have 4.5 crore hawkers, 7.5 crore shops, which are retailers. And then the dependent livelihood ecosystem is somewhere the multiplier effect of 14 to 15 crores. And with the hawkers, it's around 20 crores. So somewhere it gives an impression that it is trying to be stringent on the e-commerce world for its practices, whatever that may be, whether it's good or bad. But at the same time, it is soft on the offline world because these rules are largely driven for e-commerce. So the legislative intent here has been largely for consumer protection, but it is tending to create 2 categories of customers, one who buy in the offline world versus one who buy in the online world. And in the online world, again, there are differentiations. So it doesn't basically categorize. If I am an offline retailer, tomorrow I decide to go online, I get caught by the same set of regulations. So just to conclude this particular section of your question, the consumer of tomorrow is changing. I mean, most of the consumers today are expecting that goods will be dropped at their doorstep at the swipe of a screen and a click of a button. So when the offline world now begins to realize that and starts becoming online and starts shaking hands with the new age customer, they too would be subject to similar regulations which are there, because there is no distinction between a large, medium, or a small. And which means that if I'm a small bakery going online, I'll be subjected to the same set of regulations, which is where your some of the things that you raised on private labels and preferential treatment and verticalization, all of them start slowly kicking in.
Right. Yeah, great opening remarks, Ramesh. So I have a quick follow-up and then I'll move to Rajeev and ask him about that implicit intent that you mentioned, right? So there seems to be a lot of overlap in terms of the regulators and the ministry is concerned itself, right? I mean, somewhere I think some of this is concerning the Competition Commission of India, somewhere it concerns DIP, as you mentioned, somewhere Consumer Affairs Ministry comes in, then rolls up to Ministry of Commerce, for example, right? So is there, is there a definite understanding in terms of whose purview that this comes from? I mean, for a person, for a lay person looking at it, it's like the classic case of someone digging up a pothole or something on the road, and then it could be anybody's responsibility to kind of come and clear it up, basically.
So if you look at the overall intent, ideally they should have been with commerce. Ideally, they should have been with DPIT, defining what you are selling, how you are selling, and all that, because it gets into micromanagement. There are aspects of even data sharing which has been brought in. There are aspects of related party which has been brought in. So which is why, if you ask me in one line, the answer is that it is transgressing multiple laws which have their own well-defined, time-tested regulations. But somewhere, as you rightly pointed out, ideally there are aspects which are under the domain of Competition Commission. There are some which are directly under the domain of the FDI rules of Ministry of Commerce. And of course, you also have the consumer protection, which was brought in largely from a consumer perspective. So somewhere it seems to be giving an impression that this is kind of the e-commerce policy, but thrown into the lap of commerce on consumer affairs. And consumer affairs, which already was empowered with these consumer protection regulations, have used it as part of their rule section of the e-commerce that they were supposed to specify. But in the process somewhere, I think I would have loved to see it come from commerce, because then your definitions would have been much more clearer. By putting it in consumer affairs domain, it is now applicable to anybody and everybody in the country. I'm not for once saying that it should be distinguished between a foreign player or an Indian player or a small player. But all I'm saying is, because the jurisdiction moved into the lap of commerce, from commerce to consumer affairs, we are now seeing a situation where it is applicable to every small-time player who has just gone online because of the pandemic. He or she will be subject to the same set of regulations, which are, according to me, quite stringent and more detailed in compliance. Plus, what will happen tomorrow? I mean, I'll wrap with an example. Tomorrow, I'm a web aggregator, and I've got IRDA regulations which says this is what you are supposed to do, and this is what you are not supposed to do. But now I say, hey, there's a consumer protection rule, which is much later legislation. So the older legislation now is in the back end. I would prefer to follow a newer regulation. He will say, fine, go ahead. I'm canceling your license. Go ahead and do whatever you want. So I have to pick and choose now. I think, which is why it is important now, because fortunately this was a consultative paper and industry has represented. So it is important now for the government to come out with clarificatory clauses to say, hey, if there's a regulation sitting here or something which has been brought out by some other ministry, then that particular rule will apply, so long as it takes care of the consumer protection. A simple thing like cab aggregator rules are now being formulated by Ministry of Road Transport, which has come with guidelines on whether surge pricing is possible, to how much extent it is possible, and what you shall charge, and how the cancellation will work. Now that is in direct conflict with how the consumer affairs say, oh, cancellation shall work this way, the e-commerce entity shall pick up this much cost. So it will be like, will IRCTC pick up the cost of cancellation now? That's how the definitions can be stretched to, because it has come from consumer affairs. Had it come from commerce, the form and substance would have been different.
Right. So Rajeev, as you've heard from Ramesh, right, I think there's an implicit intent to sort of favor small businesses and also reconcile two different worlds, right? The online world and the offline world, and reconcile definitions of what a platform and a marketplace is, and so on and so forth. Now, it's a very tough regulatory challenge for sure, right? I mean, so how should the government be looking at some of these things?
So I think if you broadly look at the consumer interest, what do consumers want? Today, I think most people are quite happy with the selection and pricing offered by the large e-commerce platforms, right? And there are now vertical marketplaces emerging that are specializing in different kinds of goods. And for various reasons in the last 1 year, people have gotten accustomed to even shopping on them. So, for example, someone who would, let's say, buy baby products from a small local store is now buying on one of the many kind of baby product e-commerce platforms. And that habit is forming. They are more than happy to do that. So the consumers want range, selection, lower prices. That somewhere sort of comes in conflict with the government's interest to preserve, the status quo to some degree, because they want things to change, but not too fast, is how I see it. So as Ramesh was mentioning, probably around 20 crore or livelihoods at stake. Those who are running the small shops and other kinds of stores, and can they all digitize fast enough? Can they all come online fast enough? It's an open question. And in fact, we are hearing nowadays of some of the larger, retailers trying to achieve that, right? Like they are saying that we're going to bring the small kirana guys onto e-commerce, and that's kind of the thesis of a player like JioMart, for example. So it remains to be seen how it will play out, but the priorities somewhere are not in sync. Right. So what a consumer may want and what the government may want, somewhere there is a kind of conflict. Maybe conflict is too harsh a word, but somewhere there is a kind of cross purpose over there. So I think the way to sort this out is, this muddle of regulations that we've just heard Ramesh talk about is maybe actually counterproductive. So, some more clarity on definitions, on enforcement, who's responsible for what, maybe would ease the path for the businesses in particular, and then consumers who outnumber the producers in this case would overall benefit more.
Right. So I have a related question, right? I mean, there's this clause which I think it's called the related party clause, where they say that the particular platform or the marketplace essentially cannot sell their own goods, right? I mean, they should strictly function as a marketplace, right? They can't favor their own goods or products and so on, right? I mean, what do you think about that specifically? Because I think that is also a bone of contention with either of the large e-commerce players having their own products and so on, and favoring those over some of the other businesses on the platform itself.
No, so this is an issue, and it's connected also with what we just mentioned on private labels and verticalization, right? So, and this is not peculiar to India, I would say. It's also something regulators in the EU and the US are wrestling with. So for example, should an Amazon be allowed to favor its own brands on its own platform? While that has been happening for a long time in offline retail, there are certain scale efficiencies you derive when you do it in the online format. So I think this is still being kind of debated. So I don't have any straight answers on that, but I would say that generally I think consumers have benefited enormously because of e-commerce in India, and that has been driven. They're essentially proxies of the e-commerce platforms selling on the platforms, right? So whether we want to keep that going, whether we want to shut that down, that is I think a bigger regulatory challenge for not just India, but for probably governments across the world right now.
So, Ramesh, let me come back to you. There's also this liability issue, right? I mean, who really is responsible for any good sold on a particular platform? Is it the individual seller on the platform? Is it the marketplace itself? And what is the mechanism for someone to seek redressal on this? Let's say they have some kind of a grievance or whatever. Who is it that they should seek this kind of redressal from, right? So, what are your thoughts on that? How much liability should either of them take? I
think it's an interesting scenario we are all kind of experiencing. If you look at where should I buy what and who is the seller, and if you look at that kind of a discussion that goes on. So let's assume that I'm buying a plane ticket today, and I could go and buy it in Air India. I could go and buy it buy it in the Indigo kind of a portal, or an app, or I could even buy it from a Yatra or a Make My Trip or whatever. You have multiple platforms. So a consumer, when he buys in a platform, let's assume Make My Trip or a Yatra or whatever, suddenly realizes that when he buys the ticket and he goes for cancellation, the presumption is that this ticket is sold to me by this intermediary, and therefore I'm liable to refund from this intermediary. And that's a valid way to look at it. But ultimately, when you buy a ticket, whether you buy it on this intermediary or you buy it on the airline's own direct portal or app, the cancellation rules are pretty clear. Whether I buy it on IRCTC, on Indian Railways platform as well, the rules are very clear. That if you cancel in this time, this is what you have to pay. If you cancel within so many hours, this is what you have to pay. If you cancel it after the plane has left or the train has left, this is what you need to pay. I think somewhere what it makes very clear through this example is that the end seller is ultimately the one who dictates in certain kinds of industries how his or her product will be sold or services will be sold. But for the consumer, the presumption has always been that I bought it in this portal, so this guy is responsible for everything, which is partly true and partly false. Partly true to the extent that, yes, my transaction happened with you. Partly false to the extent to presume that, so what if the airline rules is there, I would expect full money from you because this is the way, it's a deal between us. I don't care about the airline. Now, what this leads to is, if you look at it, whether it's in insurance business or whether it's in airlines business, there are different models where either the money goes as a seamless pass-through, or for that matter, the money comes in and sits and then gets settled quickly or is prepaid by the travel portal. So the presumption here has always been that make the intermediaries fully responsible. And if you look at one of the clauses, it actually says that they shall bear the cost of cancellation. So imagine that I'm selling you tickets worth 1 lakh rupees and I might be earning 1,000 rupees out of it, but I've been told to refund because you missed the flight or the flight got cancelled. The airline is sitting on my money, and airlines are not in a great of financial health to dole out money immediately because they would prefer to keep the float. So the onus falls on the intermediary. So to your question, there's a presumption amongst consumers that certain sellers are actually the intermediaries and not the final sellers. And that has to come out very clearly, which is why this one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. Whereas if I was a platform selling my own good, and I said that, oh, here is my good and I'm taking it back, and my own seller is taking it back, this rule will be more easily applicable because I have control and I know how to control and how to go about giving you the goods or take it back or give you a refund. But not in a case where it is dependent on a third party. So I think that distinction doesn't come out in these, that there can be different forms of business, there can be different dependencies, there can be different controls, and that the consumer has to be educated in this regard. So I think that distinction, to your point, is that for me, ultimately as a consumer, for me, the final seller is responsible. And if the intermediary happens to be a final seller or someone who has a great degree of control over the good, then I would consider the intermediary as the final seller. So it depends across the kind of transactions we have.
Right. Yeah, it gets further complicated when you're talking about, let's say, the quality of the product or the service itself, right? I mean, if, for instance, I procure a product and then, I'm harmed in some way, right? So who's responsible in that case? These are...
Yeah, so I'll just add a point there. So for example, this debate is there and we have been debating about this. Somebody said, okay, if I go to a shop and buy it, the seller is responsible. Now the Kirana seller would tell me back saying, hey, but you saw the model space on the display board, you got influenced by that and you came and bought this oil or whatever. But if it turns out bad, ideally, the rule says that you're supposed to call that customer complaint cell, which is there on the box or in the can. But instead, I go and get a police guy and go and thrash the Kirana owner, which is equally unfair. At the same time, it is equally unfair that if I'm running a shop in a mall, you say the mall has to be overhauled for, or rather pulled up for the fact that I bought one thing in your mall and it turned out bad. So there are different degrees. It's a complicated world in the consumer space and in the food supply chain space. So I think the degree of control and the influence factor has to be factored.
Right. So Rajeev, another key aspect is the whole pricing part of it, right? Obviously all of the e-commerce folks exercise all of these flash sales, deep discounting, so on and so forth. And clearly they can absorb all of these things, right? Because the model sort of supports that. We've seen plenty of these people running into hundreds, if not thousands of crores of loss. So the argument here is that, they're unfairly competing with the smaller sellers, right? So should the government, exercise some kind of pricing control on this? If that is the case, how should the guardrails be defined in your opinion?
So there are, I think well-defined rules for predatory pricing, right? That's what I think you are hinting at, where, we call it capital dumping, you call it predatory pricing. There are sort of well-defined benchmarks to assess that. I think the problem that we have in India is, we are left with vestiges of a control economy, even as we are not just liberalizing at a good pace, but also digitalizing, which presents its own challenges. So unless you have a certain internal reform where the institutions and the kind of regulators charged with sort of assessing these issues, kind of tackling them swiftly, unless they are kind of upgraded, reformed, and kind of changed in their form and structure, I think we will always be lagging behind in some sense. Because there is Rameesh was mentioning, right, that the Consumer Act comes from the 1980s. Now imagine how much the world has changed from then. So that upgradation has only happened recently now. And that too with this muddle of laws between Consumer Affairs, DIPP, somewhere there's CCI which comes in. So unless we bring clarity in this area and try to clear this morass, we will never be able to regulate sort of these changing industries correctly. So that is my kind of broader view. And on predatory pricing, of course, again, every economy, every country has that kind of protection, right? So it's perfectly reasonable for India to have that. I guess the debate is only about where the line is, sort of what the benchmark should be, which is why we need the kind of broader reforms.
Right. So Ramesh, I'd like to ask you about the data protection aspects, right? I think it also mentions that data has to be localized. You should have local servers and so on. Somewhere it also says you have to give your source code of the platform and so on, right? So seems so what is your opinion on this? I mean, should it be unique to e-commerce in that sense, or should there be like a wider bill or act protecting data in general?
Yeah, so the fundamental thing that obviously comes to your mind when you read this clause in a consumer protection rule is, why is consumer protection asking me this question on data protection or cross-selling or selling your own labels and so on, when ideally this is a far more technical subject. And if you look at, if you look at cross-selling, you were talking about cross-selling as an aspect. They don't seem to be having direct relevance to consumer welfare and is best left to consumer consent. Now, for saying that what is possible and what is not, and what is doable and what is not, it is also important for us to understand here that data sharing and related regulations have been very extensively debated over the last 2-3 years on the personal data protection bill, which is already on course. I mean, you had the change of chair recently, and it is expected that in the winter session of Parliament, it will be introduced. So when that regulation comes in saying this is how data will be shared, and even there it goes into such nitty-gritties actually, to say what is related party, whether you can share data amongst your own, about your own consumers, where do you take consent, what type of consents do you take for what kind of transactions, all of that has been dealt with in detail. So when such detailed effort has been taking place there, ideally the best way for this rules to have mentioned that would have been to say there is a parallel discussion going on this. Whenever data protection bill will come in, all of those rules will apply. But in parallel, they have actually gone into nitty-gritties of it, which somewhere will again transgress the personal data protection bill and the non-personal data protection also, which the government and Ministry of Electronics IT is working on. So the option to avail the offer that is adjacent or complementary fails solely on consumer discretion in many cases. So in fact, the Data Protection Act also talks about consumer consent and so on. If that is based on user behavior and it is based on consumer consent and so on, and that is being accorded to through the Data Protection Act, then somewhere this again contradicts in a way. Right now, if you see, that is in the legislative domain. Here we are talking about the rules, and there are references to GDPR and other aspects which are coming up in the upcoming rules or the act that will come in, and then subsequent rules will be formed. So Ideally, somewhere I think this is also stepped into the privacy domain. It has also stepped into data sharing domain and localization and others, which are again being dealt with separately as different subjects by different ministries. So I think somewhere it is important that, fortunately, as I keep saying, this is a consultative paper. Ideally, these are areas where the clarity has to emerge. Otherwise, we will be running into a scenario where we will say, okay, under consumer protection, we are all governed like this. But on RBI, it is some other way. On what you call Ministry of Electronics and IT, PDP bill, it will be some other way. We can't be having different faces for the same set of conceptual basics.
Right. So, Rajiv, we spoke about the implicit intent of all of this stuff, right? To protect small businesses. But then if you look at what the likes of e-commerce platforms have done for some of these businesses, or even cab aggregators, or some of the SME technology firms that are coming up, right? I mean, really helping formalize some of these small businesses and giving them an added incentive to formalize, right? And belong and come into the mainstream economy, right? If you look at it, they've also done so many things for these small businesses, right? So should the government at all step in and act as a sort of a protector of these small businesses, or kind of trust these small businesses to negotiate these agreements for themselves, right? I mean, I think, of course, I mean, there are a lot of these associations and so on that have put up a fight saying that, there are unfair practices, and they've asked the government to intervene. So, I just wonder, how do you balance all of these interests, and where should the government step in and do anything at all?
So, I view this like in a fairly sort of, it may seem simplistic, but, I think the way to see it is this, is that can the upgradation and the sort of formalization happen faster than the displacement, right? So can sort of even the incumbents who are trying to sort of digitalize some of these offline stores, whether it is guys like GeoMart or others who are doing it, can they succeed faster than the displacement that is in some ways inevitable by the rise of e-commerce? And I think in probably in some years it will not make sense to say e-commerce anymore, because all retail will be online, or most of retail will go online, and we won't see, at least in some categories, any kind of offline retail. So that sort of tension between the race for upgradation, formalization versus displacement, that's where we are at. And then there are many other issues that come up over here. That can some of these small store owners actually, do they have the skills, abilities, capabilities to sort of make that jump, whatever is required to do that, make that transition? Or if they actually get displaced, what is the alternative? Do they go back to farms? Do they pick up a job in some other industry? What is the alternative? And in some ways, the generational transformation that's already happening in India, often we see or hear or read that, the owner of a local neighborhood store, their children don't want to work in the store. They want to do something else. So generationally also, I think people are less amenable in some ways to sort of work in a kirana store, right? The younger people, if they can help it, they'll do something else. So there are all these kind of narratives, kind of trends happening simultaneously. And, I would not want to be the person trying to balance all of them. I can tell you that much.
Yeah, certainly complicated. We've been talking about e-commerce players with a broad brush, right? I mean, we've not made the distinction between the likes of, let's say, Tata, Reliance, and Amazon, Walmart, and the others, right? So Ramesh, should there be separate rules for some of these large players itself? I mean, perhaps based on how much of their shareholding is Indian versus foreign, and things to that effect, or I mean, there should be a broad-based approach to all of them in general.
Well, I'm not in support of any distinction, because we as an organization don't support protectionist policies. But at the same time, what's important is two things. I mean, one is, of course, consumer protection, because it shouldn't result in a scenario where the consumer is at the mercy of somebody after years because of the monopolies that can get created. But at the same time, it is also equally important to understand that one thing that distinguishes India from rest of the world, I mean, rest of more I would not say the whole developed world, but I would say the ones where you see riots on the streets. One thing that distinguishes us from them is that if you look at in the 80s and 90s, or even in the 70s and 60s, if you didn't have a job, you will open a shop. If you didn't have a job, you will at least spread a cloth and sit on the street and sell something. It was more considered honorable to start your own business and be self-reliant than go and beg. So that is what triggered this volume and amount of hawkers and traders. I'm not saying that every jobless would have opened a shop. There are people who aspire to open a shop and make it big in their gully or mohalla or whatever. There are people who aspire to run a chain of stores. So you had two classes of people who were either forced to open a shop or aspired to open a shop. And therefore, that is what gave rise to this healthy kind of, I mean, today you have something like 45,000 plus market committees in this country. The reason why that is there, and right up to the hilly stations to even your local core city market committees that you come across. The reason that thrived is because of this zeal to open something and trade and be entrepreneurial. That entrepreneurial spirit somewhere, as Rajeev has also kind of hinted, has moved into the new generation, but in a different form. The new generation may not like to be holed up in a market, may not like to be sitting in a MSME or a factory waiting to being at the mercy of somebody else. They would like to say, how do I connect more faster and quicker and make my product more peppy and optics wise more visual and appealing. So that has led them to move towards technology. Now, if you look at it, post demonetization, we moved quickly to digital. I mean, every hawker today is seamlessly adopted digital form of payment. Every vegetable vendor today has a QR code in his store, right? Apart from the light that he has. So that's how they have made the transition on digital payments. Now, as regards online is concerned, as I keep telling, the consumer of yesterday is slowly getting reduced. I mean, in the urban centers, I'm not talking about tier 2, tier 3, but largely in the urban centers, you're seeing a tendency of the next generation who feels it's probably a waste of time. And I've been part of many of the deliberations, even with the traditional retailers and the traders body and so on. One of the most beautiful things that they debate is what? Are we as a constituency ready for the consumer of tomorrow? Because the consumer of tomorrow goes to morning, works in the office, comes back home, husband and wife are working, they sit together and how they shop. That's what they kind of show. And they say that when they come to your store, you need to even reorganize yourself on how do you display your products. Because if the person has difficulty looking at what products to go for, he had rather buy one or two. And then the next question comes in is I have to pay by cash. So I go for searching for the nearest ATM. These are the issues that constituency is debating. But yes, I mean, somewhere that constituency is equally worried that people with deep pockets are burning cash, possibly, and they may go out of business. And this is taken from the US example, where many of the stores went out of business. Some in India as well are going. It's a combination of online as well as pandemic, I would say, when the lockdown happened. So it is worrisome for that community. But the answer therefore lies is that are we looking at different rules for different people? It will obviously get questioned internationally where they will say, oh, this country has different rules for different kind of people. And somebody may question it in international courts. So the government is also equally in a bind to say, okay, how do I balance all of them? Like Rajeev was saying, he's trying to do a balancing job. But the government has even in a versatile situation trying to balance this, not appear too anti-trade, not appear too anti-technology, but at the same time, not appear too protectionist, but still the underlying constituency of 20 crores remains there. So I wouldn't recommend, but what I would rather suggest is there should be a clear-cut mechanism on what the consumer is aware and what kind of seller he should go after, and the protection mechanisms and the administrative systems that Ministry of Consumer Affairs has to put in place. At the same time, the consumer should be educated enough to know whose collar to catch, which currently doesn't seem to be well in place as far as education is concerned. And the more important thing is, the moment abuse is established, there are automatic mechanisms. Probably the Competition Commission and other acts must be strengthened more to give teeth to see if there is potential abuse visible, then how do you go after abuse? Because you can't be saying, okay, you can't grow this much. I can't be telling this is the price you should be selling. I can't be selling this is the size of business you can have. That will be self-defeating.
Right. Yeah,
Rajeev,
Rajiv.
to add, Roshan, on this point, I think the jurisdictional point actually, which Ramesh is talking about. So, counterintuitively, when there is kind of jurisdictional overlap, confusion, it actually hurts consumers a lot, right? So
Right.
when you don't know who's supposed to give you justice or who's supposed to speak for you, then that actually helps producers more than consumers. I think we should keep that in mind actually.
Right. Yeah. So Rajiv, I was going to ask you about the flip side of this whole thing, right? Which is that, we're seeing record amounts of funding come into the Indian startup ecosystem, right? We saw Flipkart, for example, raise $3 billion. There is also an imperative to sort of encourage this innovation in the ecosystem itself, right? So how can the government not freak these people out and, still appear friendly enough to sort of encourage these investments and innovation in this sector, basically?
No, I think as far as the government's intent and positioning is concerned, there's no confusion there, right? So the Prime Minister himself has said this is going to be India's decade, right? So he called the 2020s the decade for India. So I don't think the government wants to sort of stop this or slow this down or whatever, but it is just a question of ensuring that the transition is, you can't. I don't think you can have a painless transition, but somewhere the transition that the Indian economy is going through, and like I said, there are multiple things going on, right? The formalization side, the penetration of technology, it's in places where no one could have fathomed actually even 5-6 years ago how deep and far it has spread. So all of these things together, and then we have a job creation sort of imperative. So all of these things together require that somewhere Indian business also has to be forward looking. I think many of the e-commerce platforms themselves are trying to drive this, and I think in a different way, reforms in other sectors will have a good second order sort of positive effect for areas like e-commerce. Indirectly, if you create jobs in another sector, the dependency on a area like, let's say, retail, trade, or agriculture reduces. So let's say if Make in India becomes more successful in the next 3, 4, 5 years, and tons of jobs are created there, then the pressure on retail, trade, and agriculture to absorb people, to provide livelihoods is reduced, and thus there is more space for having efficiency in these areas. So in that sense, it could be something indirect. You have to push reforms in manufacturing and those kind of areas to take the pressure off of retail and agriculture.
Right. So finally, to close the loop on this discussion, what is the road ahead? How should policy and regulation adapt to this ever-changing innovation? Right. So Ramesh, could you lay out a few principles that you would advocate?
Yeah. So if you look at, and I just had one more concluding point on the separate rules for Indians and MNCs. I think one of the things that both the offline and the online world and people who are domiciled in India and who set up proper businesses and shop in India also equally suffer is the fact that there are people who still sell from overseas and they don't have a permanent establishment in India. So that is one area where we still need to make progress in terms of policies and regulations. That is one thing that can make a lot of difference and take away a lot of misconceptions. Plus, of course, not only misconceptions, but also certain practices which otherwise can be avoided. So I think that is one thing I wanted to submit. But in terms of policy and regulation, this is something I keep telling that if you draw up a frame and say innovate within this, then obviously you will innovate only that much. If I say I allow you to innovate, then you might innovate beyond and start trampling on other jurisdictions. So somewhere you have to draw the line in between to ensure that I've given you the scope for innovation, but at least I've drawn the line somewhere. And considering that the internet tech ecosystem has a constant requirement for innovation, because if you don't innovate, somebody else will come with a newer, faster business model and cross you tomorrow, making you redundant. It is always important that innovation and regulation has to go hand in hand in a collaborative model. For example, I mean, if you look at other countries like Australia and others, they're coming with these sandbox models, enhanced regulatory sandbox, where they say that it allows businesses and people to test innovative products before you get consent to operate there, and so on. So we could look at those kind of collaborative sandbox models where regulation and innovation plus newer business model will all have a place to stay and thrive and grow, minus of course the abuse part of it, which and of course the bypassing borders and jurisdictions part of it, which can have a damaging effect on the local system, both offline and online.
Right. Yeah, I think the headline is basically be proactive, work with the various stakeholders, right? And you could be approximately right rather than accurately wrong about some of these things, right? And trust people and trust entities to negotiate and form these relationships themselves, right? Rather than you wanting to adjudicate every relationship in the ecosystem. So yeah, thank you so much, Ramesh. Thank you, Rajeev, for this wonderful discussion. I think we covered various nuances related to this policy, right? Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you, Roshan.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharatvaarta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharatvaarta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvaarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.